and we will begin today's presentation to talk about the work of Tarsila, Amaral, Ana Maria Maiolino, and Tecla Tofano, as Tanya has just mentioned before. And we will discuss a very interesting subject that I feel very passionate about, that I name Eating Modernity. And I'm going to start by talking about that. I'm going to start by discussing what we understand as modern. And because for me, this title is very interesting, is very important in a way. And I want to ask you, maybe you want to write it on the chat for you, what it means to be modern, what it means to be like modernity, modernization. What does it make you think? Modernism. I know many people have asked me, for example, the difference between modern art and contemporary art. I don't know if you've ever asked yourself that question. Is it the same thing? Can we say it's the same thing? And you see in this part of the presentation, I use the famous word post. Now that we're in the times of post-truth, post everything. So what is it to be postmodern, and why am I talking about this before talking about this wonderful group of women? So I'm waiting for you, for anyone, if you want to share in the chat what you think about modern is or modernity. If not, I can start giving you some answers myself. Okay, so basically for me, modern is usually a subject or a theme that is related to new, right? It's something that tries to move away from the concept of tradition. So modern is an idea that we want to move away from the past to move forward to the future, with the idea that the future is going to be better, right? And in a way, it relates a bit with the concept of the contemporary, but the contemporary is more related to the now. It's a concept more related to today. So you can be contemporary no matter what time in history, you can be contemporary. Whereas modern is something that is inspired to be something new, moving away from tradition, creating something new. I'll say that again. But again, with this idea of tomorrow is better than today. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the concept of modernism was introduced in the art industry, in the art history, around the 19th century, when the industrialization and the scientific developments were starting to question that itself, and the concept of evolution came to be. So programs came to be, industrialization, we were moving towards an ideal, better society. And it came with this idea that we could actually conceive an ideal society. But what happened? What happened was that, like we saw in the previous class that we had last time, after World War II and the Cold War, we started to question whether the future was actually better and we could actually live a better future. I don't know if you feel it right now with climate change and everything that is happening with coronavirus. We might fear that tomorrow might not necessarily be better than today. I don't know if you feel that. But this idea changed drastically how we understand art, and thus was created this concept of the postmodern. Questioning, and it's a theme that is questioning the right now, the present. Instead of focusing on the future and conceiving an idea that the future will be better than today and an ideal future, we're actually questioning this understanding of, can we actually achieve an ideal? Does this ideal actually exist? And this is particularly important for Latin American art, as we're going to see right now, because Latin American art, by the time like Tarsila Amaral was happening, and so did Ana Maria Maiolino, and Latin American in general, we were craving for this sort of modernity and modernism that was happening in Europe. But the reality in Latin America was completely different. So we were actually questioning if we ever achieved that type of modernity that Europe was aspiring to achieve or not, or how did we do it? And this is what I feel where we need to begin with the work of Tarsila Amaral. So Tarsila Amaral was an artist, a Brazilian artist, and she moved to Paris when she was 34, and she started studying painting in Paris in the middle of the two world wars. And for me, this is very important because it was a time in history, as I mentioned in the last class, where artists were thinking, okay, we can fix society with art. The idea that conceiving a new reality, a better reality, and we can save society through art was possible. This was not yet questioned. This was going to be questioned further down the line after World War II. But this idea of modernity, of the new, and as something that we can actually aspire to achieve and to actually accomplish, was happening at that particular time in history. And she was studying in the workshop of an artist, a Parisian artist called Léger, where again, the concept of the machine industrialization was very prevalent at the time, and that's why their aesthetics were all also a bit like machine-like. And it's interesting to see that in these paintings, because you see a bit of her relationship with Léger at the time. But as she said in 1925 and 1928, a migrant, whenever the migrant travels, or I don't know, I've experienced that myself coming to live here in the UK, you start to question your own national identity and your own identity. And this is what she did. She wanted to create an art for Brazil. She wanted to create what she named the Brazilian art. And it's really interesting that she started to use certain colors, certain iconography that for her related to Brazil and to Brazilian art. But it made her also very, like, she was cataloged under this concept of the decorative or the naive. And again, framing in something that is going to frame Latin American art very much, which is this concept of the primitive and how we understand the primitive. And with this, I need to go back in time a bit. And if we go back like a few decades before, I don't know if you've seen in this image in the left, during the time of the Universal exhibitions in the 1900s, this idea of the primitive was very romanticized and very exoticized. And this primitive being, like, as you see here, they were bringing like natives to be exhibited as they were like sort of in a zoo. And you cannot see it very well in this picture, but there are people behind, like dressed in their hats and suits, seeing this indigenous people as objects, basically. And it was very romanticized by the arts as well. And if you see, for example, painters like Gauguin that you see in the top right corner, or even Picasso, they were romanticizing this idea of the native as the individual that was like preceding civilization, because they were sensing the problems with modernity, and they were sensitive the problems of modernization and progress for the sake of progress. And with that, they wanted to become and go back to a pre-modernized state, pre-civilized state, where they placed this idea of the primitive very exoticized in the top, like very idolized, which is something that makes me think a bit like Finding Neverland and Peter Pan and this land with indigenous and pirates, and this conception of how we were seen, how Latin America was seen from Europe as something very exotic, something that was meant to be seen and looked at, but not as a subject to gaze back, not as an individual itself, an individual of resistance. And unfortunately, at the beginning, the work of Tarsila Amaral was seen in that framework, and this idea of the primitive, of this idea of the decorative, almost naive. But she made a twist that for me put her, it's interesting, because if you read, many art critics, many art historians have said that Tarsila Amaral was the founder of modernity in Brazil, because at that time in the 1920s, throughout Latin America, there were many like royal academies around Latin America, royal academies that were following a particular canon in art. And for her, and for many artists at the time, they wanted to move away from that tradition and modernize their art and create something new. And with that, I'm going to move forward a bit to talk firstly about this particular painting, but she wanted to create something beyond that. And so many art historians have said, okay, she was the one that introduced these same concepts that were being developed in Europe to Brazil, modernizing Brazilian art. But for me, she went one step beyond that. And that's why I wanted to go back to this idea of the postmodern that I mentioned before, which is criticizing the possibility of development and the possibility of progress for the sake of progress in a context like the Latin American. So we see this painting that she developed in 1923. And it's a painting that she named A Negra, where she was discussing precisely this figure of the Black woman as a representation of not only a matriarchal society, but as a slave society, a representation of also this primitive subject she was seeing from Paris at the time, but also as a very, like, almost like what we were discussing before in the previous webinar that we had before with the work of Ana Mendieta, with a look of almost content, a look of power that I see there. So this is the person that we need to return their freedom, return, emancipate, and in a way defend their independence. And she was painting this painting with a type of authority that afterwards she's going to twist, and she's going to create one of the biggest turns that is going to happen in Latin American art at the time, when she developed this painting that we're going to see here. How do I, okay, sorry. Here, called Avaporu. So this is a painting that she developed as a present for her partner, Oswald Andrade, and they were playing with the words in Tupi Guarani, and they developed this word called Avaporu, which means man who eats flesh. And it's interesting because they were using this concept of cannibalism, this concept of cannibalism developed by the Tupi Guarani indigenous people at the time, where you would only eat someone with power, because if you would eat that person, you would absorb their power and make it as your own. And Oswald de Andrade took this picture and wrote the cannibalist Anthropophagic manifesto that you see on the right hand side of the screen, where her work became the iconic work for this manifesto, where he wanted to create this Caribbean revolution. But this is very important because as I was mentioning before with the previous work, A Negra, this is a work that allows Tarsila de Amaral to gaze back, to stop being an object being looked at by Europe, from Europe, but an object, a subject itself, a subject with the ability to return the gaze and say, this is who we are, and this is our new modernity. But it's a modernity that goes beyond the modernity or the modernism that was happening in Europe. It's a modernity that was absorbing also what was happening in Latin America, with our own problems, with our own situations, and our own economic situations, as we will see further down the line. And so she was using not only the colors, she was using all the iconography of Brazil, but she was incorporating a gesture that will transform Brazilian art from then on. And it's interesting that this work would go unnoticed for almost 40 or 30, 40 years, until the arrival of artists like the ones that we discussed last time, like Lygia Clark and Lygia Pape. Okay, I'm sorry. I don't know, I think I'm seeing a mistake in the, sorry, so I'm going to go back here. So we see in the work, I'm sorry, it's just that I received a message from the chat, so I got a bit confused. So we see this work did a gesture that for me went beyond placing modernity in Brazil. It did a gesture that started to criticize the modernity as we were conceiving in Latin America, and the possibility of the European modernity in Latin America. And it's interesting because nowadays many art critics and art historians are criticizing that precisely, and realizing that maybe Latin America jumped from tradition to post-modernity, not even stepping in modernity, because it was the impossibility to achieve this ideal, and not only to achieve an ideal, but to question if this ideal actually existed. And we see it right now precisely with this whole situation of Brazil with Bolsonaro, and this adoration of progress that he has in his mind, and how does that affect and compromise the current situation of Brazil. So basically, she was playing this game of presenting a thesis then an antithesis, and where she created the synthesis is in this third painting called Anthropofagia that she developed in 1929. And it's interesting, this painting, because as you see, now there are two individuals as a dialogue. And this is precisely the new dialogue that is going to begin in Latin America from that moment onwards. It's a dialogue that is no longer subject-object, but are two subjects discussing and presenting their own ideas and their own points of view. And it's a dialogue that is presenting her by those two figures facing each other and conceiving each other, in that sense, eating each other. And this is, and also another part for me very important with the title of this webinar, which is Eating Modernity. The concept of anthropophagia goes beyond just the mere fact of critiquing modernity. Is a gesture that comes from the body, is a bodily act, is an act of eating, of engulfing, digesting, incorporating everything, but also eliminating, disposing, realizing what works and what doesn't work, and also making our own. We're taking European modernity and we're eating it, transforming it, discarding it, and transforming it for our own sakes. And as I mentioned before, when she was developing these paintings when she was in Paris, but then she went back to Brazil at a time from when afterwards Brazil was faced with a terrible dictatorship at the time. And of course, her whole iconography became very socialist and almost Marxist, because she started to realize that this ideal that Europe was trying to achieve was not probably possible in Latin America. That this ideal maybe was a utopic, almost dystopic idea in Latin America. I want to recommend you a very wonderful film called Metropolis from the 1920s, where you see sort of this same dialogue where the people living in the utopia was being supported by the people downstairs living in the dystopia. So it's sort of this confrontation that she faces when she goes back to Brazil and realizes that modernity in Brazil, conceived from the European perspective, maybe is not necessarily possible, or maybe we don't want it, which is something that we start to dialogue with the artist that we saw last class with Lydia Clark, and where we're gonna see right now with Ana Maria Maiolino. So Ana Maria Maiolino, it's very interesting because she arrives after 40 years after Tarsila de Amaral, but in a time where Tarsila's work became very important. As we discussed in the previous class with the work of Lydia Papa and Lydia Clark, after the dictatorship of Getulio Vargas, there was a time where Brazil started to feel the rush of this modernization and started to create a massive urge for urbanization, industrialization between the 40s and the 50s. And it created a particular aesthetics in Brazil, as we discussed in the previous class. And if you haven't seen it, I do recommend it. We already have it recording on our website. But with the arrival of the new dictatorship in 1964, everything changed, because again, people were faced with this idea that this craving and progress for the sake of progress was leading us to crash against the wall. And this is where Ana Maria Maiolino arrives with a group of artists trying to question this. And they create a new movement called the New Objectivity, where art needed to become political again, because as we mentioned before in our previous class, during the 40s and the 50s, with concrete art and neo-concrete art, in a way, art was moving away and was becoming a bit of apolitical, just focusing on the shapes and forms. Whereas with here, we see that art was becoming a tool for change. And the tool for change, they saw that inspiration in the work of Tarsila de Amaral, in the need to go back to our own bodies, to become to our own primal state, but not from an exotic point of view, but from our perspective of our own bodies and how we understand ourselves. And so she takes this concept of digestion, of the power of the mouth, and how much we have to eat and swallow, especially in a time where, imagine yourself, she's being faced with a dictatorship in Brazil, not being able to speak, not being able to manifest or to reject the ideas that were being imposed to her at the same time. And all she had to do was eat it and digest it and process it, and not being able to move. And in a way, it's very interesting, her work in particular, because as she said when she arrived, she didn't arrive to Brazil first. She came from Italy, and she came after World War II in Italy, after there was like a crisis and a famine, and a lot of people were dying of hunger. So she had to travel to Latin America. And again, it was a new dialogue between Europeans and Latin Americans after World War II, because a lot of people that were coming from Europe, like her, she was not coming as a colonizer. She was not coming from a position of power. She was coming to Latin America as a refugee to find that new personality, that new perspective, to redefine herself. And first she arrived to Venezuela, and then she went to Brazil. And in a way, she always felt displaced, because I don't know, another recommendation that I want to recommend, a wonderful book that I read recently called The Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin. She has a wonderful quote that says, "The journey is about the return." Her inability to return to her place of origin, her inability to return to her identity, made her feel that she was from nowhere. She wasn't from Venezuela. She wasn't from Italy. She wasn't from Brazil. She wanted to feel Brazilian. She co-created one of the biggest movements in art movements in Brazil during the almost 60s, 70s, called the New Objectivity. But people in Brazil never accepted as Brazilian because her Portuguese wasn't perfect. And she married a Brazilian artist, and then she moved to New York. And in New York, they did an exhibition of Brazilian artists, and of course, they didn't include her. And she felt like very frustrated because her husband was included. He was Brazilian, she wasn't, although she co-created the same movement. So this displacement, this inability to speak, to be able to be part of, is something that she was, again, relating with this bodily aspect of ourselves. And it's interesting because at the time, everything became more corporeal, and that's why many artists at the time were using performance, film, photography to express their own artistic ideas. And which is why she started to create this other body of work, one that we see here called By the Thread, and here on the left are stills from a video called In Out Anthropofagia. As you see, she's using the same concept as Tarsila de Amaral, because for her, this notion of digesting but also ejecting, like not just ingesting but ejecting what we come out, and of course questioning this tension of gender and what it is to be a woman at the time, what it is to be men at the time, and how these two identities fuse, and how she has to swallow because her inability to speak, her powerless against the dictatorship at the time. This beautiful work called By a Thread, where her mother feeds her and she feeds her daughter. And it's a beautiful process of how life is defined by digestion. She has this saying that everything begins and ends through our mouth. We start to live through our mouths and we die through our mouth. And it's a process that it begins and ends, and everything relates to ourselves. And obviously related to this idea of freedom, of repressive organs of the dictatorship, the inability to articulate words, the inability to relate to a language that wasn't hers, and her inability to communicate or generate a discourse or a dialogue by challenging her own position as a gender itself, and her inability to express by being a woman at the time, and migrant refugee woman at the time. And she takes this one step further. I want to read to you some of the things that she said at the time, and her statement of how she felt, because of course at the beginning she started saying to say, like, I was digested by them because she was the European, so she apparently was the one, like, she gazed back, but she was being digested by the Latin Americans in a way. But afterwards, she realized that she could also use this concept of digestion to ingest other poetries, other cultures, other art expressions that came to be at the time. So she said, in my digestive tract, the culture of my native land, Calabria, down in the southern Italy, blended with the culture of Tupi-Guarani lands, I became Calabrian Tupi-Guarani. Logic failed me, that obligation to be coherent. I was freed from teaching a catechism, I found freedom. The spirit refuses to conceive spirit without body. The fecal mortar transformed all my taboos into totems. I revived from that equation. I became from the cosmos to the cosmos coming from me. And finally, I breathed in the law as an assurance of the full exercise of my possibilities. So everything was revolving around this digestive body of work. And finally, this is a beautiful piece that I want to share. She started to challenge, precisely as I was saying to you at the beginning, with this notion of the postmodern, the present time in Latin America, and the inability to eat, and precisely how life and death begins with our mouth, and how some people can eat and some people cannot. And during the dictatorship, or as soon as the dictatorship just ended, she developed this installation, which is very beautiful, called Rice and Beans. I'm sorry, I'm blocking part of the installation with the text so you can read what she wrote. It's a poem that she wrote next to the text. But in this installation, you see a group of plates where they have seeds from rice and beans. And throughout the installation, those beans, rice and beans, would be fed and would germinate. So you would see the process of growing beans and of rice and beans throughout the installation. And you would see these empty glasses of water and all these different placements there and empty plates around them. And at the beginning of the first installation, people were meant to be placed outside the installation, just being there to look at, not to intervene, just to realize that some people can eat and some people cannot. And at the end, you would see that at the very end of the installation, you see a sort of a TV where she had a mouth in the process of eating. And of course, she was faced with hunger in Italy, and then she was faced again with hunger in Latin America, where it's a country of not just a country, a continent of abundance, where you plant a button and you have a tree of shirts. It's an abundant continent filled with food, which is why it's a paradox that there are so many people dying of hunger in Latin America. And this is a feeling that she wanted to battle against, and she manifested in this installation, where people were just there to observe the possibility of abundance, the possibility of eating, but not being able to eat themselves. So this is why she accompanied this installation with this text that says, "Eat while I eat, 2/3 of humanity almost don't eat. They die while I eat. There is hunger in Piauí, in Pernambuco, Bahia, in the Amazon region, while I eat. Africa agonizes in hunger. People die of hunger while I eat." And this is a beautiful work that again relates to the power of Anthropofagia, which is the power of understanding that everything at the end of the day is not intellectual. Modernity is not intellectual. For many Europeans, it was intellectual after they crashed and they experienced everything they experienced during the 20th century. But for Latin America, modernity was never intellectual. It was a bodily act where people ate and some people didn't. When progress destroyed the Amazon, it was never intellectual. It was part of our own embodiments. It was part of our bodies. And relating precisely to this installation and performance, we see the work of this wonderful, also Italian Venezuelan artist, Tecla Tofano. And it's beautiful. It's a beautiful work that she developed, what people who eat. And I find the work of Tecla Tofano particularly beautiful because she challenged one of a medium that is a very particular medium. Marta Traba, which is she's an art historian, I'm sorry. She wrote that Tecla Tofano had two part of her practices regarding ceramics. One where she used this utilitarian concept of ceramics, and one where she became more political through the ars politica that she developed. But talking about ceramics is a technique that usually has been cataloged as craft. As we say in Spanish, artesanía. It has never been placed in this iconic or exotic realm of art, and usually is being downgraded as a craft, and it's sold as a craft. Because and we always wonder, we need to ask why do people consider it as a craft, and why is it design, or why, and usually it's because of its utilitarian aspect. Usually ceramics are meant to be used as objects, as plates, as cups, as something that has a purpose, whereas art tends to be more intellectual and intends to be like something that doesn't have a means for its own, rather than just questions and present questions for us to answer. Whereas ceramics was something relating to this utilitarian perspective. And precisely Tecla Tofano wanted to criticize this utilitarian perspective of ceramics and challenge this idea. And it's interesting because when I studied here in the UK art, ceramics was never included in our program. Ceramics had an own separate design, kind of almost downgraded perspective, where people would see ceramics as something lower than the artist, than sculptures and paintings, and which is something that Tecla Tofano transformed and placed as a higher value. And I want again to tell you what Marta Traba mentioned about this particular piece that we say here, because it was an installation where Tecla Tofano created a lot of different food that was made with this ceramics. Instead of using ceramics for us to help us to eat, she created food itself. But food that, of course, you cannot eat, that is there to be watched in a similar way that of the gesture that Ana Maria Maiolino was making. And so she was making a statement for everybody that do not eat, that are fighting to get some food in the streets. And it's a banquet of ceramics. She mentions to cook this banquet of ceramics has made it very definitive, the intention of her work. It was a hidden intention, very explicit, in a dog-eat-dog world described in her work, in a very political work that is there to question what happens to the ones that eat and what happens to the one that cannot eat. And its question is precisely our consumerist society, and challenging this political idea, and how can art, and especially ceramics, can be made to become political. And then she started to go beyond that, as we see here in a series of work, a beautiful work where she questioned gender status, precisely coming from our own bodies and coming from our own bodies, our own sexuality, to change and to transform how we understand our genders and how we understand our placement as women. Because again, just like ceramics, female artists at the time were placed as a lower value. I don't know if we can transform that today, and precisely this is what we're doing right now. Which is why she says, I don't believe in applied art, minor arts versus major arts. I also don't think I am resolving any sculptural program, because three-dimensionality is not necessarily sculptural. Shapes are my way of expressing myself, and they are felt as such. Yes, Baroque, yes, cluttered, yes, not to be eye-pleasing, and this for me is very important. Usually ceramics, because they're utilitarian, are there to be beautiful, are there to be admired, at least to be used as decoration, like decorative arts, or used as an object that we can use. She wanted to battle against that, to the consumerist need to be beautiful, and to create a shock, to challenge our understanding and challenge ourselves through her work, which is something beautiful that you see here in the sculpture that you see on the left, where the symbol of the female symbol is like a tongue is coming out of her, and she's challenging this beautiful work that is visual reproduction medium as she challenged for me also this domination of reproduction and the visual reproduction by, at the time, men. And I don't know if we can continue to say this today, but hopefully not so much. And this beautiful word called to say in the similar way how a particular gender controlled the visual reproduction and what it was being said and what it was not being said at the time. And again, for me, it's very interesting because Tecla Tofano was also Italian. She arrived to Venezuela when she was 25, if I'm not mistaken. You can clarify, Carla, here. But she was also faced with this being an immigrant in a different country, trying to create herself anew and trying to speak a different language, speak Spanish, and challenge the stereotypes of how women were being seen at the time, and being submissive and being beautiful. And again, like I've had this conversation with Carla, her daughter, at the time, and this visual need of women to be pretty and be quiet, because quiet you look more beautiful, which is beautiful that she's developing a sculpture that says to say, precisely the power of words and the power of language, just like Ana Maria Maiolino was doing at the time. And again, for me, she goes and I finish this presentation with this work that relates a bit to this same thesis, antithesis, synthesis structure that we were seeing at the beginning with Tarsila Amaral, with this notion of challenging gender, where she names her, him, they, and this idea of challenging the stereotypes of genders that were happening at the time. And we see that very prevalent today, and precisely, this is precisely the work that we're doing with this project that we're developing, trying to question whether or not it exists a female aesthetic or a male aesthetic. Why do we have to follow certain standards? Why are people being sold more expensive just because they are from a certain gender? And how can we reinvent ourselves by challenging precisely the ideal? And I go back to the title that we had at the beginning, Eating Modernity. Modernity made us believe that there is a better tomorrow, but there is an ideal of tomorrow. I want to question that. Why do we need to believe in those ideals? We need a tomorrow. We definitely need a tomorrow, but we need many tomorrows. We need many ideas of tomorrows. Not one person, not one society has the ideal of tomorrow. And this is why I find the three of them, their work, a bit postmodern, because neither of them were proposing an ideal of tomorrow. They were challenging the present, like postmodernity does. They were challenging the now, and they were confronting us to create a new understanding, but a new understanding that is related to plurality, many presents, many ideas. Let's challenge and confront them all. Because in Latin America, that's what we have. Many at the same time. We cannot just pick one. We cannot just blend them all together. We have plurality. And this is how I want to end today before we go back into questions. So I give back the word to Tanya. Before we go back to questions. Tanya? I don't know if it's here. Okay, so.
Sorry, I'm here.
Okay.
Thank you, Daniela, for all that. We received many questions, and you can keep sending your questions, please, through the chat. Let me show my video. I don't know how to, oh yeah. Okay. Okay. Before we start our Q&A session, we want to thank everyone again for joining this webinar. And please, just to remind you to share the content with your network, please follow us and tag us on our social handles. Our Instagram is Women Artists Latin America. Also, we are happy to announce that we're launching a special program for you to champion the work of women artists from Latin America, Spain, and Portugal. So, through a £5 monthly donation, you will be able to receive monthly exclusive content. And through your support, you will be able to support the investigation and content creation we're doing in Amalgama. I will send you the link through the chat in a minute. Also, we appreciate any donation of any amount. So please visit our website, and the link is in the chat, and you can learn more about our work. Now, Daniela, I will give you some questions. First, let me go here. Okay. Someone said, I was lucky enough to see Tarsila's retrospective at the MoMA in New York City and Ana Maria Maiolino in Whitechapel Gallery. But I have never seen Tecla Tofano's work. Where can I see it?
Oh, that's a wonderful work. And this is a question that I have to admit, I don't know the answer, because we have here, I'm very privileged to know her daughter that is also here in this call, but at the same time it's very difficult to trace all her work back, like getting the pictures. And recently there was a big exhibition of her work with many other artists of Latin America called Radical Women. But again, tracing all this work back was difficult, and I would need to keep you informed on that, because I would love to see her exhibited again and see her work live. Yes, you can unmute yourself, Carla.
Hello, that was wonderful, Daniela. Thank you so much. And there's an interest in the Museum of Art, Contemporary Art of Paris. They contacted me recently. Apparently, there's a gallery in Barcelona that is doing a lot of research about Tecla, and they fell in love with the political aspect of his work, because obviously it was very avant-garde for her time, and he is trying to buy some pieces of found collectors, but the situation in Venezuela at the moment is so bad that it's not helping at all. But there's a hope that maybe before I die, I could see the work of my mother in a kind of anthology made in Europe. It would be fantastic, and I think she totally deserves it.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Like you were saying, is very important, because we need to understand that despite the fact that Tecla originally was from Italy, she was developing her work in Venezuela in the 70s. Yeah. And I have to stress this very much. Latin America and Venezuela in the 70s was a very conservative society. It was a society also driven by, of course, this idea of development with the rush of the oil industry at the time as well. So we need to understand that challenging this utilitarian aspect of ceramics and challenging her political views and her gender views so abruptly in a very conservative society like it was the Venezuelan at the time, it's incredible. And she was definitely before her time. Absolutely.
What who eats, lo que comen los que comen. That exhibition was impressive, because I was 1 year old, but I saw photos. It was a whole gallery with a big table full of people made in real life with ceramics, eating food. Like it was like a response to a famous movie, I don't know if you know, called La Comilona. That was an Italian movie, very famous. I can't remember now the name in Italian and the director, but I think she was impressed about that.
Yes.
And it was really visually
striking,
baroque, and to the point. It couldn't be more straightforward.
Yes, absolutely. This text that I have here that I read to you a few phrases before was precisely in at that time Marta Traba went and saw the exhibition, and she was incredibly surprised by the level of extraordinary aspect of her work, and all these different foods produced in ceramics, all this inability to eat because it's there to show that it's a potential food, but you cannot touch it, you cannot eat it, you cannot do anything, just observe and just feel the feeling of not being able to eat like so many people do. It's incredible. It's an incredible work, definitely.
I know it's not relevant, but also it may be interesting that herself, she was a little bit anorexic, I would say. She ate a very little.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So she never was really into any level of, you know, like really bad. But she had a conflict with that. So I think it's even, there's the political side and there's the psychological side.
Personal side, absolutely. And I feel like the political and the personal, precisely, it becomes one. And I think this is what I feel with the three of their work. And this is precisely the twist of the Anthropofagia, because it's personal, it's your own body, it's your own digestion, it's your own bodily fluids. It has to be because of you, and it has to be personal, which I find very, very important, precisely from this Latin American point of view. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carla, for sharing that. If you have other questions, you can also unmute yourself.
Yes, please feel free to unmute yourself or raise your hand if you want to say anything. We do have another question, Daniela. It says, how do you think these artists will express themselves in reaction to the poverty we're seeing today in supposedly the most affluent time in human history, and more specifically as a result of the economic turmoil resulting from the COVID crisis?
I think their work is it's speaking to our situation right now, because their work speaks about this paradox of abundance, of hunger in a land of abundance, which I find is Latin America. If you go to Colombia, you would see fields of food, fish that you can get. Like it's an abundant land, but at the same time, it's one of the countries with the biggest levels of hunger, and so did like in Brazil and so on. So this is a paradox of this modernity project that I was referring at the beginning. This idea of progress for the sake of progress, and this idea of abundance, but it's abundance for a certain few. And this is the challenging part. And this is the clash that the three of them faced in a way. The three of them saw, each one from their own perspective. Maiolino running from Italy because of this clash. Also Tecla Tofano, and then and Tarsila Amaral arriving to Brazil and realizing that this idea that the people in Europe were living was not even possible in Latin America. So it's precisely to face with this clash, face with the clash that what I was telling you at the beginning with this movie, Metropolis, where some people do live in this abundant, affluent time and affluent world, but most people don't. And this is why what precisely they're reacting against. That's why some people eat and some people don't. And this is precisely also in the work of Ana Maria Maiolino, where you see the food at the distance germinating in front of you, but you're there just to observe. So I think all of their work relates precisely to what we're feeling right now. This tension, this the reality that we need to question the present right now, that we need to question, not just to live in an ideal, but to see and question the present. I don't know if I answered that question.
Okay. I don't know if anyone wants to unmute themselves and raise their hand and have a discussion with Daniela. We do have another question, Daniela, from Natalia. Says, Dani, you mentioned that modernity in Europe was intellectual and in Latin America, it was through feelings. Do you think the artists you discussed today were analytical in approaching their work, or did their work and then you, or did they did their work and then you came in hindsight, see the process and idea behind it?
Oh, absolutely. I think, of course, the work is also intellectual, but it's more what I tried to say, it was more like a bodily experience. It was both an intellectual as a bodily experience. It was not just an idea to be conceived. And it's something that I'm not going to lie that, of course, Europe felt itself. And I feel like precisely what they lived before World War I and during like the time of both wars and with World War II questions precisely this idea of modernity and progress and evolution and industrialization, and it challenges precisely this idea of the ideal of achieving a future and thinking that tomorrow is going to be better than today. But what I felt in Latin America is that it's more bodily. It's not just that they're facing, and their artistic turn is that they wanted to incorporate all of these critiques into their own bodies, and they manifested that through their own art. That's why they started to, precisely in the 70s and in the 60s, 70s in Brazil and many other artists around Latin America, they started to use their own bodies as a way of expressing this tension and expressing this paradox of facing this, of impossibility to achieve the ideal, or even inability or not being able to actually want to achieve this ideal.